He found her in a burlap sack beneath a sycamore tree, half dead, bound at the wrists, clutching a marriage contract with his name on it. She was supposed to be his bride. Instead, she looked like someone had tried to make her disappear. What Elias Boone didn't know yet was that the men who left her there weren't finished, and saving her was only the beginning of what it would cost him. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Subscribe and follow so you don't miss a single part of what happens next. The wagon hit a rut in the road, and Elias Boone didn't bother steadying himself. He just let his shoulder knock against the wooden side frame and kept his eyes on the trail ahead, the way a man does when he's already decided he doesn't much care how the ride goes. Beside him on the bench, his daughter Lucy sat with her hands folded in her lap, her Sunday dress ironed flat, her dark hair braided with a blue ribbon she had tied herself 3 times before she got it straight. She was 8 years old, and she had been preparing for this day for 2 weeks, and Elias had spent those same 2 weeks trying not to think about it at all. "Do you think she'll like the ribbon?" Lucy asked. "What ribbon?" "This one." She pointed at her own hair. "I picked blue because Mama used to say blue was a friendly color." Elias looked at his daughter for a moment. She was staring forward at the road with that careful, hopeful expression she had whenever she wanted something badly enough that she was afraid to say so. "I think she'll notice it," he said. That was the best he could offer. Lucy seemed to accept that. She went back to looking at the road, and Elias went back to not thinking about what waited for them in town. The truth was, the whole arrangement sat wrong with him. It had from the beginning. 3 months ago, his neighbor Cal Whitmore had suggested it over a fence post and a tin cup of bad coffee, the way men in the territory suggested things they were too polite to outright push, with a sideways look and a lot of throat clearing. There's an agency out of Ohio. Decent women. Widows, mostly, or women with no prospects back east. You write a letter, they write back. You come to an understanding. Elias had said he'd think about it. Then he'd gone home and stared at the ceiling above his bed for 2 hours and thought about his daughter learning to braid her own hair because there was no one to teach her, and thought about the long winters when the house felt like the inside of a sealed box. And by morning, he had written the letter. Her name was Nora Ash. She was 26, originally from Illinois, had been working as a seamstress after the family she'd been employed with relocated east. Her letters were brief but not cold, practical, measured. The letters of a woman who had learned not to want too much and was careful about what she put in writing. She said she could cook and keep a house, and she was not afraid of hard weather. She said she understood this was a practical arrangement, and she had no illusions about it. Elias had read that line twice. He wasn't sure if it made him feel better or worse. They had agreed on a date. She would arrive by stage on the 15th of October. He would meet her at the depot in Larimer Crossing, and if they both found the arrangement agreeable after meeting in person, they would proceed to the courthouse the following morning. It was the 15th of October. The stage had arrived at noon. Nora Ash had not been on it. The depot master, a thin man named Greer, who always seemed vaguely irritated by everything, had checked his manifest twice and told Elias there was no woman by that name on the passenger log. The stage had come out of Cheyenne with 11 passengers, every one of them accounted for. No single woman traveling alone. Elias had stood on the platform for a while after that, his hat in his hands, not sure what he was waiting for. Lucy had held his hand and not said anything, which was how he knew she was trying not to cry. He'd asked around. The postmaster, the woman who ran the rooming house, old Pete Archer, who spent his afternoons on the bench outside the mercantile watching the road because he had nothing else to do. No one had seen a woman matching Nora's description arrive in town. No one had seen anything unusual. But then, Elias noted, unusual things happened all the time in Larimer Crossing without anyone much noticing. By mid-afternoon, with nothing else to do and no answer to bring home to his daughter, Elias had started back toward the ranch. He told himself the woman had simply changed her mind. It happened. People wrote letters and made arrangements and then had second thoughts, and the sensible thing was to go home and get on with the business of living. He was almost convinced. Then Lucy said, "Papa, stop!" He pulled the horse up. She was pointing off the road to the left, toward the old creek bed that ran parallel to the trail for about a mile before curving away into the hills. There was a stand of sycamore trees there, their branches stripped nearly bare by the October wind, their white trunks pale against the dark sky. "I see something," Lucy said. Elias saw it too, a shape on the ground beneath the nearest sycamore. Dark, like a pile of cut wood or a bundle of feed sacks someone had dropped. Except it wasn't the right shape for either of those things. He climbed down from the wagon without a word and told Lucy to stay put. She didn't argue, which meant she already suspected something was wrong. The grass was long and the ground was soft from recent rain. His boots sank slightly with each step. As he got closer, the shape resolved itself. It was a burlap sack, the kind used for grain or potatoes, but larger, cinched at the top with a length of rope. It was moving. Elias stopped. The sack moved again. A slow, labored shifting, like something inside it was struggling to breathe. He covered the last 10 yards at a run, dropped to one knee beside it, and got his knife out. He cut the rope and pulled the burlap apart, and what he found inside stopped him cold for a full 3 seconds. A woman. Young, somewhere in her mid-20s, with dark hair matted against her face with blood and dirt. Her wrists were bound in front of her with wire, the kind used for fencing, and it had cut into her skin badly enough that the cuts had dried dark. Her left eye was swollen, almost completely shut. There was a gash above her hairline that had bled heavily and dried in streaks down the side of her face. Her dress, a dark traveling dress, the kind a woman might wear on a long stage journey, was torn at the shoulder and caked with mud. She was breathing, barely. Elias had seen men hurt in range accidents, had once found a hand who'd fallen off a roof and broken most of the bones on his left side. He knew how to stay calm when someone was badly damaged. He put his hand on the woman's shoulder, just the lightest touch, and said, "I've got you. Stay still." Her one unswollen eye opened. It was dark brown, and for a moment it found him and held pure animal terror, the look of something that has been cornered so many times it no longer expects anything good from the world. "You're safe," Elias said, though he had no way of knowing if that was true. "I'm not going to hurt you." He needed to check her for injuries before he moved her, and when he opened her coat to look, something fell out of the inner pocket and landed in the grass beside his knee. He picked it up. It was a folded piece of paper, creased and smudged, but intact. He opened it, though he already felt something cold settling in his chest before he read a single word. It was a marriage contract. His name was on it. Elias James Boone, of Larimer County, Wyoming Territory. And on the other line, in careful handwriting that matched the letters he had received over the past 3 months, Nora Catherine Ashe, of Hamilton, Ohio. He looked at the woman lying in the grass in front of him. He looked at the contract again. He looked back at her. "Nora?" he said. The woman's eye closed. He carried her to the wagon himself. She weighed less than he expected, and that worried him. The way it worried him when a fence post that should have been solid came out of the ground too easily. She didn't make a sound when he lifted her, which either meant she'd lost consciousness or she'd gone somewhere deep inside herself where the pain couldn't reach her. He didn't know which was worse. Lucy had climbed into the wagon bed without being asked and cleared a space and laid his rolled canvas tarp flat for Nora to lie on. She was watching everything with her jaw set and her hands folded. The same expression her mother used to get when she was working out a problem that required her full attention, and she didn't want anyone interrupting. "Is she the lady from the letters?" Lucy asked. "I think so." "What happened to her?" "I don't know yet." "Is she going to be all right?" Elias set Nora down gently in the wagon bed, adjusted the tarp under her head, and looked at his daughter. "I don't know that either," he said, "but we're going to do what we can." Lucy nodded once like that was a satisfactory answer and sat back on her heels to keep watch over the woman for the rest of the ride home. Elias sent a hand named Deke into town to fetch Dr. Prentice, and Prentice arrived 2 hours later in his buggy with his black bag and the look of a man who had seen plenty of damage in his years on the frontier and had gotten very good at not showing what he thought about it. He worked on Nora for the better part of an hour. Elias waited in the kitchen and made coffee he didn't drink and tried to think through the situation in a logical order. The facts, as he understood them. Nora Ashe had been on her way to Larimer Crossing. She had not arrived on the stage. She had been found bound and beaten, left in a burlap sack off the road approximately 2 miles south of town. She was carrying his marriage contract. Someone had done that to her deliberately, tied her up, put her in a sack, and left her there, either assuming she would die before anyone found her or not caring either way. That was what he knew. Everything else was a blank. Prentice came out of the back room wiping his hands on a cloth and sat down at the kitchen table without waiting to be asked. He looked tired. "She's stable," he said. "For now. Cracked ribs on the left side. 2 of them, maybe 3. Laceration on the skull that bled a lot but didn't penetrate. Bruising on her face and neck consistent with a serious beating. The wire cuts on her wrists aren't deep enough to cause lasting damage, but they'll need to be kept clean." He paused. "She's malnourished, Elias. Not just from whatever happened today. She was thin coming into this." Elias nodded. "She was conscious briefly while I was working," Prentice said. "She said one word. I'm not sure it means anything. What was it?" "Children." Prentice looked at the cloth in his hands. "Just the one word. And then she was out again." Elias didn't know what to do with that. "She going to wake up?" he asked. "Probably. Might be tonight, might be tomorrow, might be a day or 2. Bodies take the time they need." Prentice put his bag back together. "She shouldn't be moved, and she shouldn't be alone. Can you manage that?" "Yes. I'll come back in the morning." He stood, put on his hat. At the door he stopped. "Elias, you know this is going to get around. A woman found beaten half to death outside of Larimer Crossing. People are going to talk." "People always talk." "This is different," Prentice said. "Someone did that to her on purpose. And whoever it was, they might not be done with her yet." He left that where it was and went out to his buggy. Elias stood in the kitchen for a long time after that, listening to the wind off the hills and the quiet sound of Lucy's voice coming from behind the bedroom door. Low and steady, the way you talk to something hurt, just to let it know someone's there. That night was long. Elias set up the chair from his study beside the bedroom door, close enough that he'd hear if anything changed. Lucy had fallen asleep at the foot of the bed. He'd carried her to her own room twice, and she'd come back twice, and on the 3rd time he'd given up and left her a blanket. Around midnight, Nora Ashe opened her eyes. Elias was awake. He was almost always awake at midnight. It was a habit he'd never been able to break since his wife Margaret died, the way the house got too quiet at that hour, and sleep became something he chased without ever quite catching. He leaned forward. "You're at the Boone Ranch," he said, keeping his voice low. "You were injured. The doctor's been here. You're safe." Nora looked at the ceiling. Then she turned her head and looked at him, and the same terror he'd seen in the field moved across her face again, but slower this time, more controlled, the way a person braces themselves instead of flinching. "The contract," she said. Her voice was rough, barely above a whisper. "I found it in your coat pocket. It's here." She closed her eyes briefly. "You're him, Elias Boone." "That's right." She didn't say anything else for a moment. He could see her working through it, the effort of being conscious, of assembling what she knew into some kind of order. Her hands moved slightly on the blanket as if she was reaching for something that wasn't there. "I don't," she started, then stopped. "I can't." She put a hand over her face, not crying, just covering. "I can't remember. The stage. I was on the stage, and then—" "You don't have to remember tonight," Elias said. "I have to." Her voice sharpened slightly, some edge coming back into it. "There was something I need to tell you. It can wait." "It can't." She lowered her hand and looked at him directly. Up close, even swollen and bruised, she had a face that was used to being determined about things. "There's something I was carrying, not just the contract, something else. I had it with me on the stage. She stopped. The focus left her eyes and she pressed her palm against her temple. "It's gone," she said, quieter now. "I can't find it." "What was it?" She shook her head slowly, not refusing to say, actually not knowing. "I don't know. I can almost see it, but I can't. I can't get to it." There was something that might have been fear underneath her frustration, not of him, but of the blankness itself, of not being able to reach what she needed. "I'm sorry." "Don't apologize," Elias said. "You were beaten and left in a sack. Give yourself some time." Something small crossed her face at that. Not a smile exactly, more like she'd taken note of him. "My daughter's asleep at the foot of the bed," he said. "Her name is Lucy. She stayed because she wanted to. She's 8. Nora turned her head carefully and looked at Lucy bundled in the blanket. She tied the ribbon herself, Elias added, and didn't know exactly why he said it. It's a good ribbon, Nora said softly. They were quiet for a while. Outside the window, the wind had picked up. Somewhere on the ranch, one of the horses shifted in the stable. I'm not going to send you away, Elias said eventually. It felt necessary to say clearly. Whatever happened to you, I don't know yet. But you came all this way and someone did that to you, and the least you deserve is a roof until you're healed enough to make your own choices. Nora was quiet for a moment. You don't know me. I know you're on a contract with my name on it, and you were left for dead 2 miles from my front door, he said. That's enough for now. She looked at him for a long time. He couldn't tell what she was thinking, which didn't bother him. He didn't expect to know what she was thinking yet. That kind of knowing took time. All right, she said at last. She slept again shortly after that, and this time the sleep looked less like unconsciousness and more like actual rest. Elias sat in his chair until the gray early light began to show at the window, thinking about a woman he didn't know who was carrying his name in her coat pocket, and about the one word she'd said in her sleep while the doctor was working. Children. In the morning, things started moving before Elias was ready for them to. Cal Whitmore rode over before breakfast, which was not unusual. Cal was the kind of neighbor who didn't wait for an invitation. But the look on his face when Elias answered the door was not the usual look. There's talk in town, Cal said, standing on the porch with his hat in his hands. I figured. Deke went for the doctor. People saw. Greer at the depot is telling anyone who'll listen that you went there asking about a woman who never arrived. By this morning, the story is you found a woman half dead by the creek road. That's accurate. Cal glanced past him into the house. Is it her? The one from the letters? I believe so. Cal worked his hat brim in a slow circle. Elias, you need to be careful here. A woman found beaten like that. People are going to wonder what she's running from. Or who, Elias said. Either way, I'm just telling you the shape of what's coming. People around here, he paused, picking his words. They're going to want answers, and until there are answers, some of them are going to assume the worst. The worst about her? The worst about you too, if you keep her. Elias looked at his neighbor for a moment. Cal Whitmore was a decent man, not a mean man, not a gossip by nature, but he was also a man who cared deeply about how things looked, which meant he was often willing to do the wrong thing for the right reasons. She's not well enough to be moved, Elias said. I understand that. I appreciate you telling me, Elias said. I'll take it into account. He left that without any more attached to it and went inside. By the end of the second day, Nora could sit up. She couldn't eat much. Her ribs made even breathing painful, and the back of her head ached in a way she described as a sound rather than a pain, like a bell being struck over and over. But she was awake more than she was asleep, and some color had come back into the parts of her face that weren't bruised purple. Lucy had appointed herself caretaker, a role she took very seriously. She brought broth every 2 hours. She had opinions about how many pillows were the right number. She told Nora about the ranch with the particular thoroughness of a child who has been waiting a long time to have someone to tell things to. The horses' names, the way the creek froze in January, how many jars of pickles they had put up in August, and why Elias had made them put up so many. He says you have to prepare for everything, Lucy explained, settling herself cross-legged at the foot of the bed. He says you can't ever know what winter's going to do. Nora listened to all of it. She didn't speak much herself, partly because speaking hurt, and partly, Elias suspected, because she was still trying to locate the shape of her own story, still pressing her memory like a bruise, trying to find the edges of what she couldn't reach. He sat with her in the evenings after Lucy was in bed. Not to talk necessarily. He'd bring mending or accounts and sit in the chair by the window, and she'd lie in the bed with her eyes open or closed, and they'd keep each other company in the way that people do when they both understand they're waiting on something they can't yet name. I know there's something important, she said on the third evening. Her voice was clearer now, the roughness mostly gone. I can feel the shape of it. It's like standing in a dark room and you know there's furniture in it, but you can't see where anything is. Has anything come back? He asked. Pieces, she said carefully. I remember fire, a building burning. I remember children crying. She paused. I remember being afraid. Not for myself. For the children? She turned her head and looked at him. "Yes," she said. "I think so." Elias kept that thought and didn't push it further. He had learned in his years of ranching that some things came in their own time and could not be forced, and that trying to rush them only drove them deeper. But on the fourth morning, something arrived that removed the option of patience entirely. A rider came up the road at mid-morning, not one of the local hands Elias recognized. A lean man in a good coat, too good a coat for trail work, on a bay horse that had been ridden hard and recently. He stopped at the gate and called out, "I'm looking for Elias Boone." Elias came out to the porch. "That's me." The man reached into his coat and held up something. A piece of paper, folded once. "I'm an investigator, sent from the state office in Cheyenne. My name is Aldous Crane." He said it the way men say their names when they want you to understand the name means something. "I have reason to believe you're harboring a woman wanted for questioning in connection with arson, murder, and theft." The word harboring landed with a kind of weight that Elias noticed. "I'm going to need to speak with the woman you brought home 4 days ago," Crane said. "I'm going to need to do that today." Elias stood on his porch and looked at the man on his horse and thought about a woman with a bruised face and wired wrists lying in his back bedroom who had been left for dead in a grain sack in the middle of a field, and about a little girl who had tied a blue ribbon in her hair and was inside right now teaching that woman the names of all the horses. "You can get down off your horse," Elias said, "and I'll hear what you have to say." He didn't say anything more than that. He had learned that a man who rushed to explain himself was a man already losing ground. Whatever Aldous Crane was bringing to his door, Elias understood one thing clearly in that moment. It was not going to be simple. It was not going to be quick. And the woman in his back bedroom was at the center of something large and dangerous that had barely started to show its shape. He held the porch and waited. Aldous Crane accepted the offer to come inside the way a man accepts something he was already planning to take, with a nod that was barely a nod and no particular gratitude in it. He tied his horse at the post and came up the porch steps and through the front door like he'd been in the house before, his eyes moving across the room in the practiced way of someone cataloging exits and contents before he'd even taken off his hat. He didn't take off his hat. Elias noticed that. He noticed the coat too, up close. Wool, well-made, with brass buttons that hadn't tarnished. Not a man who spent much time in weather. The paper he'd held up at the gate was tucked back inside his breast pocket, and he hadn't offered it for inspection, which meant either he didn't think Elias would ask, or he didn't think it mattered if he did. "Sit down if you want," Elias said. Crane pulled out a chair at the kitchen table and sat, setting his hat on the table beside him. A small territorial move, the hat where Elias's hands might otherwise rest. Elias remained standing. "The woman's name is Nora Ash," Crane began. He had a flat carrying voice, the kind built for courtrooms or open fields. Originally from Illinois, she came to our attention approximately 6 weeks ago in connection with a fire in the town of Kellerton, Nebraska, an orphanage called the Hargrove Home for Children. The fire destroyed the main building and killed 2 men, employees of the institution, whose remains were found in the wreckage. Elias said nothing. She was identified by 3 witnesses as having been present at the facility in the days preceding the fire, Crane continued. She had been posing as a volunteer worker. After the fire, she disappeared. We believe she took with her certain documents belonging to the institution. What kind of documents? Financial records, correspondence, materials relevant to the ongoing management of the home. Crane spread his hands on the table, an open gesture that didn't match the closed quality of his eyes. "Mr. Boone, I'm not here to cause trouble for you. You found a woman in distress and brought her to safety. That speaks well of you. But the woman you're protecting has a serious warrant outstanding against her, and holding her here puts you in a difficult position." "What position is that?" "Obstructing an official inquiry," Crane said. Simply. No heat in it, just the flat presentation of a fact. Elias pulled out the chair across from Crane and sat down. He put his arms on the table and looked at the man directly. "Let me see the warrant." Crane reached into his breast pocket and produced the folded paper again, holding it across the table. Elias took it and opened it and read it through twice. It was printed on official-looking paper with a seal at the bottom, the state seal of Nebraska, or something close enough to it that Elias couldn't say with certainty it was wrong. It named Nora Catherine Ash. It cited arson, manslaughter, and theft of institutional property. It was signed by someone whose signature was not legible. Elias folded it back along its creases and handed it across the table. "This is a Nebraska warrant," he said. "We're in Wyoming. Extradition is a process," Elias said. "That takes time. It's through the county sheriff." He sat back. "You're not the sheriff." Something moved behind Crane's eyes. Not surprise exactly, more like a reassessment. He'd come in expecting to collect and leave, and now he was understanding that this was going to be something else. "I have a letter of authorization from the state. I'd like to see that too." Crane produced it. This one had more signatures, a different seal. Elias read it. It authorized one Aldous Crane to investigate the whereabouts of persons named in connection with the Kellerton fire and to arrange for their transport to Nebraska for questioning. It said, "Arrange for transport." It did not say remove by force. "This says you can arrange," Elias said, "through proper channels." "Mr. Boone?" Crane's voice stayed level, but there was something underneath it now, like a current running under still water. "I'm trying to handle this quietly for your sake. If I have to bring the county sheriff into this and make it formal, the attention that brings to you and your property is going to be considerable. You have a daughter. A ranch. A reputation in this community. A woman wanted for killing 2 men is not someone you want associated with your name." It was a careful threat, the kind that didn't name itself as one. Elias recognized the shape of it. "The woman in my back bedroom," Elias said slowly, "was found bound with fence wire and sealed inside a grain sack, beaten badly enough that my doctor wasn't sure she'd survive the night. That's what I know about her. What you're telling me is what someone else wants me to believe about her." He met Crane's eyes. "Those aren't the same thing." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight. "I'll tell you what I'll do," Elias said. "She's not well enough to travel. That's a medical fact, and Dr. Prentice will put it in writing. When she's well enough, if there's a proper process through the county sheriff, I'll hear it. Until then, she's a guest on my property, and you're welcome to wait in Larimer Crossing for that process to begin." Crane picked up his hat from the table. He stood without hurrying. "You're making a mistake," he said, the same way a man says it when he's not talking about mistakes at all. "Might be," Elias said. "I've made them before." He walked Crane to the door and watched him ride back down the road, and stood on the porch until the dust from the horse's hooves had settled back into the dirt. Then he went inside and sat in the kitchen with his hands flat on the table and tried to think through what he'd just agreed to. From the back of the house, he heard Lucy's voice, and then, quietly, Nora's. He got up and went to stand in the hall outside the bedroom door. "And that one's Hector," Lucy was saying. "He bites if you come at him from the left, but he's fine on the right. Papa says he got spooked bad when he was young and never forgot it." "Smart horse," Nora said softly. "Remembering what hurt you." "Papa says it's not smart, it's just stuck." "Sometimes those look the same from the outside," Nora said. Elias stood in the hallway and did not go in. He told Nora about Crane's visit that evening. He sat in the chair by the window and told her plainly what the man had said. The warrant, the charges, Kellerton, the fire, and watched her face while he said it. She listened with her eyes fixed on the ceiling and her hands still on the blanket. When he finished, she was quiet for long enough that he thought she might not answer at all. "Kellerton," she said finally. "The word came out carefully, the way you handle something with an edge. Does that mean something to you?" "I don't know." Her voice was frustrated in a specific way. Not with him, but with the inside of her own head. "It's like, when you say it, something moves, but I can't see what it is." She pressed 2 fingers against her temple. "There was a fire. I've been seeing it in pieces. A building, wooden, old, children in nightclothes." 2 men died in the fire," Elias said, according to Crane. She turned her head and looked at him. "And he says I killed them. He says you were there before it started. There's a distance between those 2 things." "I know that," Elias said. She studied him. "You believe me." "I haven't decided what I believe," he said, which was honest. "But I also don't believe a woman who was beaten and bound and left to die in a field was the one with the upper hand in whatever happened." Something passed through her expression. Something like the first small easing of a tension that had been held too long. Not relief, exactly. More like she'd been braced for a wall and found a door instead. Crane's going to come back, Elias said. I know. And he's not going to come alone next time. I know that too. She was quiet for a moment. I need to remember. Whatever I was carrying, whatever I had on that stage, it mattered enough that someone was willing to kill me for it. If I can just find the thread. She pressed her eyes shut. It's there. I know it's there. Don't force it, Elias said. She opened her eyes and looked at him. I can't afford not to. He didn't have an answer for that, because she was right. Well, the talk in town took 3 more days to reach the full volume he'd been expecting, and when it arrived, it came in the form of no, not that. In the form of 3 men from the Larimer Crossing Business Council showing up on a Tuesday morning. Owen Ferris, who ran the bank, Theodore Holt, who owned the feed store, and 2 other properties besides, and Carl Deming, who had the dry goods and also served as the town's unofficial keeper of what was appropriate and what was not. They came in Ferris's buggy, and they stood on the porch in a row, hats in hand, the way a group of men stands when they've agreed on something beforehand and just need one of them to say it out loud. Ferris was the one who said it. He was a careful man, Owen Ferris. Measured, not unkind, but very aware of what things cost. Elias, we understand you're in a difficult position. Nobody here thinks you meant any harm by what you did. A man finds an injured woman, he helps her. That's decent. But, Elias said. Ferris glanced at the other 2. The investigator from Cheyenne has been in town. He's been talking to people. What he's saying, charges of arson, 2 men dead, that's serious. And there are people who are uneasy about you keeping this woman here while that's unresolved. People, Elias repeated. It's not a small number, Holt said. He was less careful than Ferris. Some of the families near your property have concerns if she's wanted in Nebraska. She hasn't been convicted of anything, Elias said. Nobody said she was. But the appearance of the thing... I'm not running my ranch based on appearances, Theodore. Deming cleared his throat. He was a small man who cultivated the impression of reasonableness. Elias, nobody's trying to tell you what to do. We're just asking you to consider how this looks, and to consider that if the county sheriff gets involved and there's a formal process, it's going to be harder for everyone. If the county sheriff gets involved through proper channels, I'll cooperate with that process, Elias said. But I'm not going to hand an injured woman over to a stranger in a coat because he showed up with paperwork that may or may not mean what he says it means. That's not how I was raised, and it's not how I run things here. The 3 of them exchanged looks. We're asking as a courtesy, Ferris said, because we respect you. I appreciate that, Elias said. And as a courtesy back, tell Aldous Crane that if he wants to start a formal proceeding, the county sheriff's office is in Rawlins. It's a day's ride. I'll be here. He waited on the porch until the buggy was out of sight. Then he went back inside and sat down in the kitchen and put his head in his hands for just a moment. Not in despair, but in the particular way a man does when he has made a decision he knows is going to cost him and is trying to account for the full price of it. From the back room, Lucy's voice. Papa, Nora wants to know if there's any of that apple from yesterday. He picked his head up. Tell her yes, he called back. He cut the apple himself and put it on a plate and brought it down the hall. On the 6th day, Nora got out of bed. Not far, just to the window, leaning on the sill with her jaw set against the pain in her ribs. But she stood there for a long time looking out at the ranch, at the barn and the corral and the flat gray sky and the hills rolling away to the north. And when Elias found her there, he stopped in the doorway and waited. It's flat, she said. Mostly. Gets hillier north of the creek. I thought Wyoming would be all mountains. Parts of it are. This part isn't. He came in and stood at the other side of the window. How's the pain? Manageable. Which meant bad, but she wasn't going to say so. You should sit down. I've been lying down for 6 days. He didn't argue with that. She was quiet for a while, and he noticed her eyes had stopped moving across the landscape and fixed on a specific point. The road coming in from the south, where Crane had ridden in and ridden back out. He's going to come back with more authority behind him, she said. Probably. Then we're running out of time. She turned from the window. Her face in the daylight looked older than it had in the dimness of the sick room. Not older in years, but in the way of someone who has carried a significant weight for a significant distance. Elias, I need to tell you something. I don't know if it's going to help or make things worse. Tell me. She moved to the chair by the window and sat. He sat on the edge of the bed across from her. My memory isn't coming back in a straight line, she said. It's pieces, scenes, like looking at a painting that's been cut up and scattered. She put her hands in her lap. But I remembered something last night, clear enough that I think it's real. All right, the Hargrove home, the orphanage in Kellerton. She looked at her hands. I was there deliberately, not as a volunteer. I told them I was a volunteer, but I wasn't there by accident. I was looking for something. Elias waited. There was a man in Illinois, I'm trying to find his name, but I can't yet, who believed that the home was being used for something beyond what it claimed, that the children placed there weren't all being properly cared for, that some of them were being moved, transferred, to people who had no legal right to them. Her voice stayed level, but her hands tightened in her lap. He asked me to go in quietly and look. I had some experience with documentation, records. I knew how to look through files without leaving traces. You were investigating them, Elias said. Yes. She looked up. And I found something. That's what I can't reach. What I found. I know I found it. I know I was trying to get it out when the fire started. Her jaw tightened. I don't think I started that fire, Elias. I think someone else did, to destroy what I had found and to give them a reason to come after me. Elias turned that over. The logic of it was not difficult to follow. A woman who had found evidence of something serious, someone who wanted that evidence destroyed, a fire that conveniently created both the destruction and a crime to pin on her. Then she had been beaten and left for dead somewhere between Kellerton and Larimer Crossing. The two men who died, he said. Crane said they were employees of the home. I don't know what happened to them, she said quietly. I'm not saying I know exactly. I'm just telling you what I remember. Maybe they were part of what was happening there, and they were eliminated too, and I was a convenient person to blame. I don't know. She pressed her palm to her temple again. I hate not knowing. What about the documents? The financial records Crane mentioned, the ones he said you stole. She was still for a moment. Then something shifted in her expression, subtle, like a door opening just slightly on something bright. I had something, she said slowly. Before the stage, before Wyoming. I was carrying something, not on my person. I wouldn't have put it on my person. It was too... She stopped. There was a sycamore tree, she said quietly. Where you found me. He straightened slightly. I've been seeing it in the pieces, she said. That tree specifically, the white bark. I keep seeing it, and I don't know if it's just because that's where you found me or if... She pressed her lips together. I think I went there before I was taken. I think I may have hidden something there, under it or near it. Elias looked at her. I don't know, she said quickly. I'm not certain. It might be nothing. It might just be my mind making connections because of the trauma. She sounded frustrated with herself. But it keeps coming back. He stood. When you're strong enough to ride, we'll go look. Crane could be back by then. Then we'll deal with that when it comes. He moved toward the door, then stopped. Nora, what you're describing, if it's what it sounds like, the people involved aren't going to stop with sending an investigator. She looked at him steadily. I know. They're going to push harder. I know that too. And they're going to try to use everything around you, he said carefully, including this ranch, including Lucy. Something moved through her face at Lucy's name, a genuine flinching, fast and then controlled. You should make me leave, she said. It would be safer for both of you. Probably, Elias said, but I already told 3 men from town and an investigator from Cheyenne that I wasn't doing that, and I'm not in the habit of changing my answer based on how much pressure arrives. She looked at him for a moment. That is either very brave or very foolish. It's neither, he said. It's just what I said I'd do. The pressure, when it came back, came from multiple directions at once, which was how pressure usually worked when someone with resources was applying it. Crane returned on the 9th day as Elias had expected, and he did not come alone. He brought a man from the county sheriff's office in Rawlins, a deputy named Stills, young and uncomfortable looking in his official capacity, the kind of man who follows authority because he hasn't yet figured out that authority isn't always the same thing as right. He also brought a formal document, this one signed by the county sheriff himself, requesting that the person of Nora Ash be made available for interview. Elias read it on the porch with both men standing in front of him. "This says interview," he said. "It does," Stills said. "Not transport, not surrender. Interview." Stills glanced at Crane. Crane's face didn't move. "That's correct," Stills said. "All right." Elias folded the paper. "She's still not fully recovered. Dr. Prentice has documentation of her injuries. I can arrange an interview at this property with Dr. Prentice present as a witness in 3 days." "That's not," Crane started. "Deputy Stills," Elias said, addressing the younger man directly. "Does that arrangement satisfy the terms of this document?" Stills looked miserable. He was clearly not enjoying being used as a prop in someone else's chess game. "It would probably satisfy the terms, yes, if the interview is conducted formally and on the record." "Then we're agreed," Elias said, and looked at Crane. Crane said nothing, but his eyes said everything about what he thought of being outmaneuvered by a rancher who read documents carefully. After they left, Elias went inside and found Nora standing in the kitchen doorway, having obviously heard most of it through the walls. 3 days, she said. 3 days, he confirmed. She nodded slowly. "Then I need to remember faster." Lucy came in from outside with mud on her boots and didn't notice the tension in the room at all. Or if she did, she addressed it the way she addressed most things she didn't want to engage with, by going directly around it. "I named the new calf," she announced. "What'd you name him?" Elias asked. "Nora, after her." She pointed at the woman in the doorway with the confidence of someone who considers this an obvious and excellent decision. Nora looked at the girl. A muscle worked in her jaw. "Nora's a girl's name," Elias said. "He looks like a Nora," Lucy said firmly. Nora made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was close to one, and then pressed her hand over her ribs because even that small movement hurt. But it was the first sound like that she had made since Elias found her in the field, and he marked it without saying anything, the way you mark a shift in the weather. Just noting it, putting it in the account of things that are beginning to change. Outside, the wind had come down from the north and the temperature had dropped, the way it dropped on the Wyoming frontier when the season was doing what it intended, and there was no point arguing with it. Elias looked out the kitchen window at the road south, at the pale sky, at the land that was his, and might not stay that way much longer depending on what the next 3 days brought. He didn't look worried, but he didn't look it, and out here that distinction mattered more than it probably should have. Nora was watching him from the doorway. "You're thinking about what it costs," she said quietly. "I'm thinking about what's right," he said. "Those aren't always separate things." "No," he agreed. "But they're not always the same thing either." She looked at him for a moment longer, and then she turned and went back down the hall, moving carefully with one hand light against the wall for balance. The pain in her ribs was still real. He could see it in how she held herself. But she was moving under her own power now, and that meant things were shifting, one way or another, toward whatever came next. 3 days. He made coffee and stood at the window and watched the road and thought about a sycamore tree with white bark and whatever might be buried beneath it, and about a man named Crane who wore a coat with brass buttons and had not once looked like a man who was simply doing his job. The night before the interview, Nora didn't sleep. Elias knew because he didn't sleep either, and the house was small enough that he could hear her through the wall. The careful sound of someone awake and trying not to make noise about it. Around 2 in the morning, he got up and made coffee, and when he came down the hall, she was already in the kitchen doorway in her borrowed robe, her dark hair loose, her bruised face looking older in the lamplight than it did in daylight. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He poured 2 cups and set one in front of her and sat across the table. They were quiet for a while. "It came back tonight," she said finally. "Most of it." He waited. "The man who sent me to Kellerton was named Harlan Voss. He was a solicitor, worked with families trying to locate children who had been placed into institutional care and then lost track of. He'd been following the Hargrove home for almost 2 years. There were patterns he couldn't prove, children placed there who had no further records. Transfers with no destinations. Money moving in ways that didn't match the number of children in residence. She wrapped both hands around the cup. He couldn't go himself. He was known. They'd have recognized him. But I was nobody. A woman looking for charitable work. How did he know you? She was quiet for a moment. He knew my mother. She was a seamstress. She died when I was 19, and after that I did what I could to get by. Boss helped me once, years ago, with a legal matter. We stayed in contact. She paused. He trusted me. What did you find when you got inside? She set the cup down and looked at her hands. It took me 4 days. I worked the laundry, helped in the kitchen. They let me go most places without much supervision because I was useful and quiet, and I didn't ask questions about things that weren't my job. On the 4th day, I found the office unlocked. Her jaw tightened. The ledger wasn't hidden. That was what struck me. It was just there, in a desk drawer, like whoever kept it wasn't worried about anyone finding it, like they felt untouchable. She looked up. The entries went back 7 years. Children received, children transferred, but the transfer records weren't to other homes or to families. They were coded. Initials, numbers, amounts paid. There were payments received, Elias, significant amounts. For children. The kitchen was very quiet. I copied what I could, she said. Names I could identify. Numbers. I took 2 pages of original documents, the most recent entries, the ones with names still legible. I wrapped them in oilskin and I was going to get them to Voss. But before I could leave, one of the men who worked there, a big man named Buell, he saw me coming out of the office. He didn't ask me anything. He just looked at me, and I knew he knew. She stopped. That night, the building caught fire. I got the children out. There were 11 of them in the dormitory. I got them all out through the window at the back. Her voice dropped slightly. I don't know about Buell and the other man. I don't know what happened to them in the fire. I only know I didn't start it. You got 11 children out, Elias said. It's not. She stopped, uncomfortable with wherever that sentence was going. Anyone would have done that. He looked at her. Not everyone. She moved past it. After the fire, everything happened fast. Someone had horses. There were men in the road. I ran. She touched the faded bruise along her jaw without seeming to realize she was doing it. I don't remember all of it. I remember a wagon. I remember waking up somewhere cold. Then the stage. I got myself onto the stage at a stop outside of Rawlings. I had the contract. I had the documents still. I'd kept them on me through everything. And then somewhere between Rawlings and Larimer, crossing the stage stopped, and she stopped. They found you on the stage, Elias said. They must have been watching the stops, looking for a woman traveling alone. She pressed her eyes shut briefly. They took the documents, or they thought they did. I had moved them. Before we reached the last stop, something made me uneasy. A rider I saw twice on the road, keeping pace, and I got the documents out of my bag, and I got off the stage at the water stop near the old creek road, and I put them somewhere. The sycamore, Elias said. She nodded slowly. I was on foot. I didn't know the land. But there was that tree. It had visible roots, old ones, raised above the ground. I put the oilskin packet in the hollow beneath the largest root and covered it over with dirt and bark. Then I tried to make it back to the road. A pause. I didn't make it far. Elias sat with that for a moment, the full shape of it assembling itself in his mind. The packet still there, under the sycamore, 2 miles south of his front door. 2 miles south of where Crane was likely sleeping right now, in a room above the Larimer Crossing Hotel, with his brass buttons and his official paperwork and whatever he'd been promised for bringing her in. If the documents are still there, Elias said, they should be, if no one else knew to look. She met his eyes. But Elias, what's in those ledgers implicates people with money and with reach. The reason they came after me instead of just running is because they can't afford for anyone to read those names. If we bring those documents out into the open, it gets worse before it gets better, he said. Significantly worse. He stood and went to the window. The yard was dark, the barn a black shape against the slightly less black sky. Somewhere out on the road, a set of hoofbeats. Probably nothing, probably someone riding home late, but he listened until they faded. "We can't wait for the interview," he said. "If Crane has enough authority to conduct a formal proceeding, he has enough authority to search the property. And he'll think of the sycamore eventually, if he hasn't already." "I know." He turned from the window. "Can you ride?" She looked at him steadily. "My ribs still hurt." "That's not what I asked." A silence. "Yes," she said. "I can ride." "Before first light," he said. "Before anyone's watching the road." He woke Lucy at 4 in the morning and told her they were going out early and that Deke would be in the yard if she needed anything, and she should not, under any circumstances, open the door to anyone she didn't recognize. Lucy absorbed this with the seriousness of a child who has learned not to ask questions when her father's voice has a particular quality. "Is Nora coming back?" she asked. "Yes," Elias said. "We'll be back before breakfast." Lucy looked at him with those careful dark eyes. "You sure?" "No," he said, because he couldn't lie to her, and she knew it. "But that's the plan." She settled back into her blankets, satisfied in the particular way children are when an adult chooses honesty over false comfort. Outside, Elias saddled 2 horses in the dark, moving by touch and habit. Nora appeared in the barn doorway in her traveling dress, the same dark dress she'd arrived in, which had been washed and mended by Lucy with somewhat uneven stitching. With his old barn coat over it, and her hair pinned up beneath a wide-brimmed hat he'd offered her from the peg by the door. He helped her up without asking if she needed it, which she appreciated, because she did need it, and she would have said she didn't. They went out the east side of the property to avoid the main road, through a shallow creek crossing that made the horses uncertain in the darkness, then south along the backside of the ridge, until they could cut down to the creek road at an angle that kept them below the sight line from town. Nora rode without complaint, though he could see in the gray pre-dawn light how she held herself, the careful management of each breath, the slight forward lean that took pressure off her left ribs. She didn't say anything about the pain. She kept up. They reached the sycamore as the first thin light was beginning to show at the eastern edge of the sky. It looked different in the early morning than it had when he'd found her there. Smaller, maybe, the way places shrink when they're not carrying their worst memory anymore. Or maybe larger. He wasn't sure. Nora slid down from her horse before he could come around to help her, landed with a sharp intake of breath she immediately controlled, and walked to the tree. She stood in front of it for a moment. "The largest root," Elias said quietly. "I know." She crouched carefully using the trunk for balance, and pressed her hands against the ground at the base of the root system. The soil was packed from recent frost, and she worked at it with her fingers, pulling away dried bark and small stones, and Elias crouched beside her and helped without being asked. They found it 6 inches down. The oilskin had done its job. The packet was damp on the outside but intact, tied with a length of cord. Nora pulled it free and held it in both hands and didn't say anything for a moment. "Still there," Elias said. "Still there," she agreed, her voice careful. She opened it there, at the base of the tree in the thin morning light, and he looked over her shoulder at what was inside. 2 sheets of handwritten ledger entries, dense with initials and numbers and dates going back 3 years, and beneath them a folded letter in handwriting different from the ledger, addressed in careful script to a name Elias didn't recognize. He read enough to understand the general shape of it, enough to understand why someone had beaten a woman and left her in a sack rather than simply warning her off. "These names," he said quietly. "Yes," Nora said. He knew 2 of them. Not well? Not personally, but well enough. One was a businessman out of Cheyenne who had interests in several territories. One was a county official whose name appeared on documents Elias had signed when he'd registered his land grant 6 years ago. Neither was a small man. Both were the kind of man who had made themselves the sort of person other people were careful around. Nora folded the documents back into the oilskin. She was still crouched at the base of the tree, and he could see that she was tired, not just from the ride, but from the particular exhaustion of carrying something alone for a long time, and only now beginning to understand that she might not have to carry it alone anymore. "We need to get these somewhere safe," she said. "There's a telegraph office in Rawlins," Elias said. "And Voss, if he's still looking for you." "He will be." She looked up at him. "If I can get a wire to him, he can have someone here within a week, someone with the authority to..." A sound. Both of them went still. Hoofbeats. Multiple horses coming from the north, coming fast. Elias stood and moved to the edge of the tree line to look back toward the road. 3 riders, still a quarter-mile off, but coming at a pace that was not casual. He couldn't make out faces in the early light, but the one in front had the straight-backed seat of a man on official business, and the coat, even at this distance, had the look of good wool. "Crane," Elias said. "He's early," Nora said, which was all she said because there wasn't time for more. She tucked the oilskin inside her dress, against her skin where it wouldn't show. She was on her feet already, moving toward her horse with the controlled urgency of someone in pain who has decided the pain is not relevant right now. Elias was already at his horse. "We go back the way we came. They'll cut us off on the ridge. Not if we move now." They moved. The creek crossing in daylight was easier than in the dark, but there was no time for caution, and when Nora's horse hit the water too fast and lurched sideways, she stayed in the saddle through what looked like pure stubbornness. Elias pushed east, then north, driving for the back fence line of his own property. Behind them he could hear the other horses, but couldn't tell if they were gaining. They came in through the barn at a run, horses blowing hard. Deke was already in the yard. He looked at them and at the horses and didn't ask a single question, which was why Elias had hired him. "Take the horses," Elias said. "Wipe them down. They've been in the stable all night." Deke took the reins without blinking. Elias and Nora went in through the back door. Lucy was in the kitchen, still in her nightgown, holding a piece of bread she'd cut for herself, and watching the door with an expression that was working very hard not to be frightened. "You're back," she said. "We're back," Elias said. "There are riders on the front road," she said. "I heard them from my window." "I know." He put his hand briefly on top of her head. "Go to your room and stay there until I come get you." Lucy went, taking the bread with her. She paused at the hallway entrance. "Nora?" she said. Nora looked at her. "The calf's fine," Lucy said. "I checked on him." Nora's face did something complicated. "Thank you, Lucy." Lucy disappeared down the hall. Crane arrived at the front door 3 minutes later with Deputy Stills and a second man who wasn't introduced but had the look of someone hired to stand in a particular place and be large. Crane's face, when Elias opened the door, was not the face he'd worn before. The careful diplomatic quality was gone. Something harder had replaced it. "Mr. Boone," he said, "I need to speak with Miss Ash. Now. Not in 3 days. Now." The interview was agreed for 3 days from yesterday. Circumstances have changed. Crane looked past him into the house. "We have information that she may be in possession of stolen documents. I have the authority to search this property." "Let me see the authority," Elias said. Crane produced it. This paper was different from the others. It had 2 signatures, one of which Elias recognized as the county sheriff's. He read it carefully. It authorized a search of the premises for materials related to the Kellerton arson investigation. Stills, beside Crane, was looking at his boots. "Deputy Stills?" Elias said. The young man looked up. "Does this document specify what materials they're looking for?" Stills looked at the document. "It says, materials related to the investigation, records or documents. It doesn't describe them further." "No, sir." "So a general search warrant," Elias said, "for an unspecified category of items signed yesterday in connection with an investigation that originated in Nebraska." He looked at Crane. "Is there a judge in Wyoming who signed off on this?" A pause. "The sheriff's signature serves as authorization under—" "The sheriff is not a judge," Elias said. "You want to search my property, you need a warrant from a judge. The nearest circuit judge sits in Rawlings. You're welcome to ride there today." Crane stepped forward. "Mr. Boone, I am running out of patience with this." "I can see that," Elias said. He did not step back. The large man behind Crane moved slightly, a shift of weight that was meant to be noticed. Elias noticed it and said nothing about it, which was a different kind of message. "If you're found to be obstruct, you have my cooperation for a formally authorized search with the judge's signature," Elias said. "Until then, you're standing on my porch, and I'd like to get breakfast on." Stills put his hand on Crane's arm. It was a light touch, barely there, but Crane felt it and stopped. "We'll be back," Crane said. "I imagine so," Elias said. He closed the door. He stood with his back against it for a moment, listening to the sound of horses moving off the porch. And then he went down the hall to the room where Nora was sitting on the edge of the bed with both hands pressed flat against her knees, breathing in the measured way of someone managing pain and adrenaline at the same time. "He doesn't have a judge's warrant," Elias said. "He'll get one," Nora said. "It'll take most of a day, maybe 2. He sat in the chair. "Rawlings is a day's ride. Then we have today." "We have today," he agreed. She looked at him. "I need to send that wire to Voss. The telegraph in Rawlings is a day away, and Crane will be going that direction." She stopped. "Is there a telegraph closer?" "Cheyenne," he said, "but that's where Crane comes from." She thought, "What about the railroad depot? Isn't there a line at—" "Garrison Flats," he said, 14 miles east, small depot on the Union Pacific Spur. They have a telegraph." He paused. "It's not a road Crane would expect." She looked at him. "Can you ride 14 miles?" he asked. "Can you stop asking me that?" He almost smiled, not quite, but almost. They went over the details quickly and practically. The route, the message to Voss, what it needed to say, and how short it needed to be to say it. Nora wrote the address from memory, which she was certain of, and the message in a compressed form that got the essential facts across in 30 words. Elias sent Deke into Larimer Crossing on an errand that would take most of the morning, which meant Crane's man, because there would be a man watching the road, would follow Deke. Then he saddled a single horse, a reliable gray mare named Fuss, who was fast and didn't spook, and went through the back field again. The problem was that Nora couldn't ride 14 miles without a stop, and she knew it, and she said nothing about it. He brought her a strip of leather to hold against her ribs when the horse moved. An old trick, something his wife had told him about from her father, who had cracked ribs from a fall. And she took it without comment and used it, and they covered the first 8 miles in reasonable time before she pulled up. He didn't ask. He just stopped and handed her the canteen. She drank, handed it back, breathed steadily for a minute with her hand pressed against her side. The sky was flat and gray above the flat and gray plain, and the wind had the kind of edge on it that promised cold weather by evening. "I need to ask you something," she said, not looking at him. "Ask. If this goes wrong, if Crane gets his warrant before we can get Voss's people here, and they take me—" She stopped. "I need you to keep the oilskin, not to give it to Crane under any circumstances. If they take me, and you give them what's in those documents, those names will disappear, and whatever those men were doing will continue, and the children who are still—" She stopped again. "Will you keep it, whatever happens?" Elias looked at her profile against the gray sky. She was holding herself carefully, the way she always did now. But there was something particularly exposed about the question, the way she'd had to ask it, the fact of needing to ask at all. "Yes," he said. She nodded once, looking straight ahead. They rode the remaining 6 miles without talking. Garrison Flats was barely a town. A depot, a water tower, a feed store, 6 houses, and a saloon that looked like it was losing the argument with gravity. The telegraph office was a window at the end of the depot platform, operated by a boy who couldn't have been more than 17, and who looked at Nora's bruised face with wide eyes, and then very deliberately looked at nothing but his equipment. She handed him the message through the window. Elias paid for it. The boy sent it without reading it aloud, which was technically not procedure, but was a form of decency that Elias appreciated. They waited. 30 minutes. Then 40. Nora sat on the platform bench with her coat closed and her eyes on the western horizon and said nothing. Elias stood at the end of the platform and watched the road. The return wire came at the 50-minute mark. The boy handed it through the window without expression. Nora read it. Elias watched her face. She looked up. "He's in Cheyenne," she said. Her voice had something in it that had not been there before. Not relief, not happiness, but something closer to the feeling of ground underfoot after a long time without it. "He's been in Cheyenne for 2 weeks looking for me. He has 2 men with him, and he has a contact at the federal district court." "Federal," Elias said. "Federal supersedes county," she said. "If Voss can get a federal inquiry opened, Crane's warrant becomes irrelevant." She looked at the wire again. "He says he can be in Larimer Crossing by tomorrow evening. He says to hold on." "Can we hold on until tomorrow evening?" Elias asked. She thought about it honestly. Crane gets to Rawlings tonight. County judge first thing in the morning. He rides back by afternoon. So it's close. It's close, she said. They looked at each other on the platform of a depot in a town that barely existed, and the math of it sat between them like a simple and uncomfortable equation. Then we go back, Elias said, and we keep Crane off the property for as long as legally possible, and we wait for Voss. That's the plan, she said. It's not a great plan. No, she agreed. It's not. They rode back into the rising afternoon wind, the gray mare working harder against the cold, and Elias thought about his daughter at home with Deke, and about a warrant that didn't exist yet but would, and about 14 miles they'd already covered in a day when Nora's ribs hadn't fully healed, and about a man named Aldous Crane who wore expensive buttons and had spent the last 9 days trying to recover something someone powerful did not want recovered. The land was flat and pale and enormous around them, the way the Wyoming frontier always was, indifferent to whatever small human struggle was crossing it. It didn't care about ledgers or warrants or men with reach and money. It just went on being itself, which was the thing Elias had always understood about this country. You could not appeal to it for anything. You just had to be sufficient to whatever it presented you with. He glanced at Nora riding beside him. She was looking ahead, both hands steady on the reins, jaw set, the leather pressed to her side. Still in pain, still here, not asking for anything. He turned his eyes back to the road. One more day. But as they came over the low rise that showed the first distant line of his fence, he saw the smoke. Not from his chimney, Chet. It was coming from the right direction for that. But there was too much of it, the wrong color, billowing gray-black against the white sky. And it was coming from closer to the barn. He kicked the gray into a run before he'd finished the thought. Nora followed without being told to. The barn was not on fire. The smoke was coming from the south corner of the yard, a brush pile that had been set alight, which anyone could have done for any reason, except that when they came through the gate at a run and Elias pulled up, he saw Deke standing in the middle of the yard with his hat off and an expression on his face that Elias had never seen there before. "They came back," Deke said. Elias looked at him. Crane and that other man, not Stills, the big one. Deke looked at the ground, then back up. "They said they were authorized. I didn't let them in the house. I stood in the door, but they—" He stopped. "They went through the barn, both of them. Looked through every stall, the tack room, the feed room. Didn't find anything, but they—" He paused again. Lucy came out onto the porch. Crane spoke to her. Elias went very still. "What did he say to her?" His voice came out flat. "He asked her if she knew where you'd gone. She said she didn't. He said—" Deke glanced at Nora, who had come up beside Elias. "He said to tell the lady staying in the house that her time was running out, and she ought to consider what it would mean for the people protecting her if she kept being difficult." The yard was quiet except for the sound of the burning brush. Nora sat on her horse and did not say anything, and her face did not show anything except the particular kind of stillness that comes after the thing you've been dreading finally arrives, and there's nothing left to brace against. "Where's Lucy?" Elias asked. "Inside, she's fine. She made herself a sandwich after they left." Elias got down from his horse. He handed Deke the reins, walked to the porch, went inside, and found his daughter in the kitchen eating a sandwich at the table. She looked up at him when he came in. "He was trying to scare me," she said before he could speak. I could tell because his voice was doing the thing people's voices do when they want you to be afraid, but they don't want to look like that's what they're doing. Elias sat down across from her. "Were you scared?" he asked. "Yes," she said simply, "but I didn't tell him anything." "I know you didn't." "Is Nora all right?" "She's in the yard." Lucy put down her sandwich. "I'm going to go tell her about the calf," she said, and got up and went out the back door with the certainty of a child who has decided the best response to being frightened is to do something useful. Elias sat alone at the kitchen table for a moment. Just a moment. Then he stood, went to the cabinet beside the back door, and took down the rifle he kept there. Not to use it, not yet, not unless everything else failed, and set it on the table where he could see it, and started thinking through exactly how he was going to keep Aldous Crane off his property until tomorrow evening without anyone getting hurt. It was not a comfortable kind of thinking, but it was the necessary kind, and he had never been a man who refused necessary things just because they were uncomfortable. Outside, through the window, he could hear Lucy's voice, and then Nora's, and beneath that the ordinary sounds of the ranch. Horses, wind, the creak of the barn door, all of it continuing exactly as it would have on any other day, which was either reassuring or an indication of how little the world adjusted itself for the difficulties of the people in it. Probably the latter, Elias thought. He put his hand flat on the table and he waited for tomorrow. Crane came back the next morning at 10 o'clock, and this time he had the warrant. Elias saw him coming from the front window. 4 riders on the road, Crane in front with his brass buttons catching the flat morning light. Deputy Stills to his right, looking like a man who had not slept well, and 2 others behind them that Elias didn't recognize. One of them was the large man who had spoken to Lucy in the yard. The other was a stranger in a dark coat with a leather satchel across his saddle, which meant paperwork, which meant this had been arranged with some care. Elias had been up since 5. He had made breakfast for Lucy and told her quietly and without drama that she should pack a small bag with what she needed for 2 days and put it under her bed where it was ready. Lucy had looked at him and then packed the bag without a word and put it under her bed and come back to eat her breakfast, which was the kind of practical response that made him grateful for her in a way that was almost painful. Nora was in the kitchen when the riders came into the yard. She had the oilskin on the table in front of her, and she looked at it for a moment, and then she picked it up and put it inside her dress and looked at Elias. "Don't give them anything voluntarily," she said. "I know. And don't let them separate us." "I know that too." She looked at him. "I'm sorry this is your front yard they're riding into." "It was my front yard before they got here, and it'll be my front yard after," he said. "Go sit in the back room. Not because I'm hiding you, because I want to read what he has before he talks to you." She went. He opened the front door before Crane could knock. The warrant was, this time, properly signed. Circuit Judge Alton Marsh of Rawlings, signature clear, seal attached, dated that morning. It authorized a search of the premises and the detainment of one Nora Catherine Ashe for transport to Rawlings for formal proceedings in connection with the Kellerton investigation. The language was precise. Elias read every word. It was real. He could see that. Whatever room he'd had to maneuver in the past 2 days, this closed most of it. He handed it back to Crane. "I'll need 15 minutes before you search," Elias said. "You don't have the right to make sure my daughter is somewhere safe and that my property is secured so your men don't accidentally leave a gate open and lose my horses." He kept his voice level. 15 minutes. Then you can conduct your search." Stills said quietly, "That seems reasonable." Crane looked at the deputy, then back at Elias. 15 minutes, he said. Elias went inside. He went to Nora first. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, the oilskin already back inside her dress, her hands folded in her lap. She looked up when he came in. "It's a valid warrant," he said. She absorbed that. Just a small settling, like something she'd been holding against a wall, finally giving slightly under the weight. "How long?" "I bought 15 minutes. Voss said yesterday evening. That means he's already on the road. Maybe 6 hours out if he left at first light." He sat in the chair. "If they take you into custody and transport you to Rawlings, Voss can still intercede. A federal inquiry supersedes a county warrant. Even if you're in a cell, if Voss gets federal authorization." "I know the law, Elias. I know you do." She was quiet. Then, "Where's Lucy?" "Her room." Nora stood and walked down the hall and knocked on Lucy's door and went in. Elias stayed in the hallway and heard their voices, low, and then Lucy's voice higher, and then quiet, and then Nora came back out with her jaw set and her eyes dry in the way of someone who has made a decision not to fall apart and is honoring that decision one breath at a time. "All right," she said. They went to the front room together, and Elias opened the door and let Crane in. The search took 40 minutes and found nothing useful to Crane, which Elias could see frustrated him in a way he was working to conceal. His 2 men went through the bedroom, the study, the kitchen, the barn. They were thorough and not particularly careful about the thoroughness. Things were moved and not all of them were put back. At one point, Elias heard something fall in the study, and he went to the doorway and looked at the man standing over the spilled contents of a desk drawer and said nothing, just looked, until the man crouched and began picking things up. Crane supervised from the center of the front room, watching Nora where she sat at the kitchen table with her hands visible on the surface, which was how he'd asked her to sit and which she'd agreed to without argument because argument at this point was a resource she was conserving. "The documents you removed from the Hargrove home," Crane said to her. Not for the first time. He'd been returning to it throughout the search with the patience of someone who believes repetition will eventually produce a different answer. "I've told you," Nora said. "I don't know what documents you mean." "Ledger pages, correspondence. You were identified going into the administration office." "I cleaned that office," she said. "I was a volunteer worker. I cleaned it 3 times. I cleaned most of the building." "You were seen leaving with materials." "I was seen leaving with a mop," she said flatly. Something moved at the corner of Crane's mouth. Not amusement, more like irritation at a specific kind of opponent. Elias stood at the window and watched the road. At the 50-minute mark, with the search concluded and nothing found, Crane turned to Nora and told her he was placing her in custody under the terms of the warrant. He said it formally, with the language of official process, and Deputy Stills produced a set of restraints. Nora stood from the table. "Those aren't necessary," Elias said. "They're standard procedure for—" "She has cracked ribs and healing lacerations on her wrists," Elias said. "Dr. Prentice has documentation. If you put wire or iron on her wrists and she's harmed in transport, that becomes your responsibility." Stills looked at the restraints in his hand and then at Crane. "She can ride unrestrained," Stills said quietly. "I'll take personal responsibility for her conduct." Crane let that stand, which told Elias something about the actual relationship between those two men. That Stills had some authority Crane preferred not to directly challenge. Lucy appeared in the hallway. Elias had told her to stay in her room, and she had stayed until she apparently decided that directive no longer applied. She walked straight to Nora and stood in front of her. "Are they taking you?" she asked. "For a little while," Nora said. "Are you coming back?" Nora looked at her for a moment, at this 8-year-old girl with the careful dark eyes who had brought her broth every 2 hours and taught her the names of horses and named a bull calf after her without asking anyone's permission. "Yes," Nora said. "I'm coming back." Lucy turned and looked at Crane with an expression that was entirely composed and entirely hostile. "If she gets hurt," she said, "my papa will know it was you." Crane looked mildly unsettled, which was the correct response to being assessed by an 8-year-old with that kind of certainty in her voice. "Lucy," Elias said. "I'm just saying," she said. "I know what you're saying. Go inside." Lucy went, but she stopped at the hallway entrance and stayed there, watching, until Nora had gone out the front door and down the steps and into the yard. Elias saddled a horse and rode with them. Crane didn't object, and Stills actively seemed relieved to have him there, which confirmed Elias's suspicion that the deputy was not entirely comfortable with the company he'd been asked to keep on this particular errand. They rode south toward Rawlings. Nora rode between Elias and Stills, Crane ahead, the 2 other men behind. The day was cold and overcast, and the road was empty and long, the kind of Wyoming day that makes the distance between places feel exact. They had ridden perhaps 4 miles when Elias heard something behind them. He turned in the saddle, 3 riders coming fast from the north. Coming from the direction of Larimer Crossing, not from his ranch. From town, from the Garrison Flats Road or the main street, moving with the kind of speed that said they'd been riding for a while and hadn't slowed when they saw the group on the road ahead. Crane heard them too, and pulled up and turned his horse. Elias watched the riders come. The one in front was a compact man in his 50s with a gray-streaked beard, wearing a dark coat, not the expensive kind, the practical kind, and a hat that had seen serious weather. He rode like someone who had been on horseback most of his life and found it less tiring than walking. Behind him were 2 younger men with the alert, contained look of people who had been trained to pay attention to more than one thing at once. The man pulled up 10 feet from the group and looked at Crane first and then at Nora, and his expression when it landed on her was the expression of a man who has been looking for something for a very long time and has not entirely allowed himself to believe he'd find it. "Nora," he said. "Harlan," she said. Harlan Voss reached into his coat and produced a document. A single folded sheet, but thick, multiple pages secured together with a stamp at the corner that Elias recognized from his own land dealings. A federal court seal. He held it out toward Crane. "Aldous Crane," he said. "My name is Harlan Voss. I'm a solicitor operating under authorization from the Federal District Court of the Wyoming and Nebraska Territories. I have here a writ of supersession issued this morning by Federal Judge Emmett Carey, which suspends all county-level proceedings against the person of Nora Catherine Ashe, pending a federal inquiry into the operations of the Hargrove Home for Children and its associated financial network. He said it the way someone says something they have been preparing to say for weeks, clearly, without heat. You are directed to stand down. Crane took the document. He read it. His face did not move while he read it, but something behind his eyes did. A quick internal reckoning, the calculation of a man who has just found the edge of the ground he's standing on. This doesn't clear her of, it supersedes your warrant, Voss said. Entirely. The federal proceeding takes precedence. Miss Ashe is to be considered a witness and cooperating party in a federal inquiry, not a suspect in a county proceeding. He paused. Unless you'd like to take that up with Judge Carey directly. He's in Cheyenne. I can give you the address. Crane folded the document and handed it back. He looked at Nora. Whatever he was thinking, he kept it behind his face, which had returned to the flat diplomatic quality it had lost somewhere over the past 2 days. This isn't finished, he said. No, Voss agreed pleasantly. It's just moved to a different venue. Crane looked at his 2 men and then at Stills. Stills was looking at the middle distance with the expression of someone who has decided to be very interested in the horizon for the next few minutes. Crane turned his horse and rode back toward Larimer Crossing. His men followed. Stills paused. Miss Ashe, he said. Nora looked at him. I'm sorry for the inconvenience, he said, and there was something in it that was genuine. The apology of a man who knew the difference between following an order and the order being right, and who had been uncomfortable with that distance the entire time. He tipped his hat and turned his horse south toward Rawlings. Elias let out a breath he had apparently been holding for some time. They camped that night on the road back toward Rawlings. Not at Elias's ranch. Not yet, because Voss needed to take Nora's formal statement and have it witnessed and signed, and because the federal proceeding required documentation that had to be assembled in a specific order. He explained this to Elias with the precision of a man who understood that lay people found legal process baffling and who had made it his business to translate it without condescension. They built a fire, and Voss's 2 men set up camp with quiet efficiency, and Nora sat across the fire from Harlan Voss and gave her statement for 2 hours, while one of the men took it down in shorthand. Elias sat at the edge of the firelight and listened. It was the first time he heard the full account. Not pieces of it, not fragments returning through the fog of injury and memory, but the whole shape of it laid out in sequence. Nora's voice was steady throughout. She did not rush, and she did not embellish, and she did not spare herself. She said clearly the places where she had made decisions that might have gone differently, where she had moved too slowly or misjudged the risk. She was her own most honest witness, which Elias noted as significant. Dishonest people, in his experience, edited their own accounts in a specific direction. Nora's account edited itself only toward precision. She described Harlan Voss's commission, her entry into the Hargrove home, the 4 days of work before she accessed the office. She described the ledger in detail, not from the documents, which were still against her skin in the oilskin packet, but from memory, which was now almost completely restored. She named the coded entries. She named the 2 men whose initials appeared most frequently on the payment side of the ledger, and Voss's man wrote them down without expression. She described the night of the fire. Getting the children out through the back window, 11 of them, ranging from age 4 to 13, in nightclothes in October. Getting them across the back field to a neighbor's barn. Going back for a child who had been too frightened to jump from the window and had to be carried. Then the men on the road, and the running and the days afterward that she remembered in pieces. When she got to the stage, to the moment she'd seen the rider keeping pace and made the decision to leave the stage and hide the documents, she paused. Where are they now? Voss asked. She reached inside her dress and set the oilskin on the ground between them. Voss looked at it. He picked it up and opened it with the care of someone handling something that has already been through more than it should have been asked to survive. He read the ledger pages in the firelight slowly. His face when he looked up was not triumphant. It was tired in the specific way of someone who has been right about something terrible for a long time and does not find the confirmation satisfying. These names, he said quietly. Yes, Nora said. I recognize two of them from my own research, he said. The others, he looked back at the pages. This is going to be a significant proceeding. I know. It's going to be long and difficult, and they will not make it easy for you. I know that too, she said. He looked at her across the fire. Are you prepared for that? She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I got 11 children out of a burning building in October in their night clothes. I survived being beaten and sealed in a grain sack. I rode 14 miles on cracked ribs. She paused. I'll manage a courtroom. Voss looked at her for a moment, and then he made a sound that was a short, compressed exhale. Not quite a laugh, but related to one. The sound a man makes when he's been carrying a weight and someone has just offered to take the other handle. The proceedings in Rawlings began 12 days later. Federal Judge Emmett Carey was a narrow, precise man of about 60 who wore reading glasses on a chain around his neck and had the manner of someone who had heard every version of every argument and was no longer easily impressed by any of them. He ran his courtroom the way a good rancher ran a property, with a clear sense of what belonged where and what happened when things got out of their proper place. Nora testified for 2 days. Elias attended both days, which he had not planned to do, and which required leaving the ranch in Deke's hands and explaining to Lucy, who had requested to come, why she could not. Is it because of what they'll say about Nora? Lucy asked. Partly, he said. Is it bad? Some of it. It's going to be a hard 2 days for her. Lucy thought about that. Will she know we're on her side even if we're not there? I'll be there, Elias said. She'll know. Lucy considered this and accepted it, in the manner of someone who has decided that the people they trust are generally handling things appropriately. The first day was, as Voss had predicted, difficult. The attorney for the men named in the ledger, a polished man from Cheyenne named Garvey, who had the kind of expensive confidence that comes from winning too many cases for the wrong reasons, spent the better part of 4 hours suggesting that Nora was a fraud, a thief, a woman with a history of deception and a motive for fabrication. He was skilled at it. He asked questions that were structured to sound like reasonable inquiry and function as accusation. He referred to her as an operative in a tone that made the word sound like something disreputable. Nora answered every question. She did not lose her temper, and she did not become uncertain, which was the more impressive of the two because uncertainty was what Garvey was trying to produce. When he suggested that the documents had been falsified, she walked Judge Carey through each entry line by line and explained the coding system in detail, specific enough that Carey's clerk had to ask her to slow down so he could keep pace. When Garvey suggested that the 2 men who had died in the fire had been killed by her hand, she said calmly that she had been across the backfield with 11 children when the fire reached the interior of the building, and that if Mr. Garvey wished to argue otherwise, he was welcome to explain how she had managed to be in 2 places simultaneously. Several people in the courtroom made sounds at that. Judge Carey looked at them over his glasses, and they stopped. Elias sat in the back row and watched her. She looked smaller in the formal setting of the courtroom than she had at his kitchen table or on horseback or in the barn doorway. Smaller in the sense that the room was imposing and formal, and she was a single woman in a borrowed dress that Deke's wife had let out at the seams to fit her. But she sat straight, and her voice carried to the back of the room without being raised. And when Garvey tried to rattle her with the speed of his questions, she simply waited until he finished before she answered, which took the speed away from him entirely. On the second day, Voss presented the documentary evidence, the oilskin pages, the letter, which turned out to be correspondence between the director of the Hargrove home and one of the named investors discussing the pricing structure for placements. 2 additional witnesses Voss had located in the weeks since Nora's testimony in the field, a former worker at the home who had kept her own private notes, and a man from Illinois who had attempted to trace his nephew through the home's records and been told the child had died, though no death record existed. The former worker was a small woman named Agnes Croft, who had left the home 3 years earlier and had been, in Voss's words, waiting for a moment when it would be safe to say what she knew. She shook through her entire testimony, but she said it all, every word, clearly and on the record. When Agnes Croft left the stand, the attorney Garvey made a motion, and Judge Carey dismissed it without looking up from his notes. The proceedings concluded at the end of the second day, with Judge Carey indicating that the evidence presented was sufficient to warrant a full federal inquiry. He said it in the particular language of legal process that meant nothing dramatic and signified everything. Voss, beside Nora at the witness table, let out a long breath. One of his men, in the second row, put his hat on his knee and looked at the ceiling. Nora sat completely still. Elias watched her from the back of the room. He saw the moment she understood what Carrie's words meant. The small stillness inside the stillness, the way her shoulders released something they had been holding for longer than just these 2 days. He did not go up to her immediately. She had Voss beside her, and there were people around her, and what she had just done had been hers to do, hers alone, in the end, however much anyone else had held the ground around her. He gave her that moment before he crossed the room. When he did, she looked up at him. "It'll take months," she said. Her voice was hoarse from 2 days of testimony, the full inquiry, the arrests, all of it. "I know. Garvey will appeal. Probably. The men named in those ledgers have resources and contacts, and they're going to spend everything they have making this difficult." She looked at him steadily. "It's not over." "No," Elias agreed, "but the part where they were going to bury it is over." She looked at him for a moment. "You sat in that courtroom for 2 days." "I did." "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to hear it." He paused. "The whole story, not pieces of it, the whole thing." She looked at him for a moment longer, and then she looked away. Not because she was uncomfortable, but because some things are easier to absorb when you're not looking directly at them. Harlan Voss materialized at Elias's shoulder. "She needs to rest," he said, practically, but not unkindly. "Tomorrow, there will be more paperwork, and the day after that more still. She should sleep while it's available." "He's right," Elias said to Nora. "He usually is," Nora said tiredly. "It's one of his less endearing qualities." Voss ignored this with the ease of long practice. The ride back to Larimer Crossing took most of the next day, and they did it in easy stages because Nora's ribs, which had not been given adequate time to heal before the events of the past 2 weeks, had made their objections known during the 2 days of sitting in a courtroom chair. She slept in the saddle for a stretch in the afternoon, or close enough to it that Elias adjusted his pace to smooth the ride. He did not point this out. By the time the Boone Ranch came into sight, the familiar line of fence, the sycamore visible in the distance catching the last flat light of the afternoon, the day had gone gray and cold in the way it went in October in Wyoming, settling into evening with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a season that had no patience for prolonged goodbyes. Lucy was on the porch. She saw them from this road and she stayed where she was. She didn't run out, which Elias noted was an act of significant self-restraint for an 8-year-old, and watched them come up the lane. When they pulled up at the gate, she came down the porch steps. "You're back," she said. "We're back," Elias said. She looked at Nora. "Did it go all right?" Nora thought about that honestly. "Well enough," she said. Lucy seemed to accept that. She looked at her father. "Deke burned dinner," she said. "I made biscuits instead." "They'll be fine," Elias said. "They might be a little flat. They'll still be fine." Lucy looked back at Nora, and there was a question in it that she didn't quite ask. The same question she'd asked before Nora was taken, but differently now, with the weight of 2 days of not knowing behind it. Nora looked down at her from the horse. "I said I'd come back," Nora said. Lucy nodded once, very precisely. Then she turned and went inside, which was how she handled the things she felt most strongly, by moving towards something practical, something her hands could do. Elias helped Nora down from her horse. She was steadier than she'd been, but tired in the bone-deep way that required something more than sleep to fix. He didn't comment on it. They went up the porch steps together. At the door, Nora stopped. She turned and looked back at the yard, at the fence line, at the sycamore visible against the dimming sky to the south. She stood there for a moment in a way that was hard to read. Not sad, not relieved, something more complicated than either. "You've been waiting," Elias said, not accusingly. "For which part?" "For it to feel like the right place to be." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Does it get easier? Trusting that a place is yours?" He thought about that. "I've been on this land for 9 years," he said. "Some mornings I still wake up and have to remind myself I'm allowed to be here, that the ground doesn't resent me for standing on it." She turned and looked at him. "So no," he said. "It doesn't get easy exactly. But you stop waiting for it to get taken away." She held his gaze for a moment, then she went inside. He followed. In the kitchen, Lucy's biscuits were on the table, slightly flat and somewhat uneven, and the lamp was lit and the stove was warm, and Deke had apparently made coffee as an apology for the ruined dinner, and all of it was imperfect in the ordinary, specific ways that real things are imperfect. And it was enough. It was, Elias thought, exactly enough. Outside, the wind came down from the north the way it always did at this hour, crossing the open land, moving through the fence posts and the bare branches of the sycamore, and then settling, as it always did, into the long quiet of a Wyoming evening that made room for whatever came next. The first frost came in November, 3 weeks after the proceedings in Rawlins, and with it came the particular stillness that settles over the Wyoming frontier when the season has finally committed to what it intends to be. The ground hardened overnight. The creek at the south edge of the property went quiet under a thin skin of ice. The horses stood closer together in the corral without anyone asking them to. Nora noticed all of it. She had begun noticing the ranch the way you notice a place when you are deciding whether it belongs to you or you belong to it, carefully, without announcing that you're doing it. The way the light came through the kitchen window in the morning at a specific angle that made the table look warmer than it was. The way the barn door stuck on its left hinge in cold weather and had to be lifted slightly when you pushed it. The way Elias's gray mare Fuss made a sound when she heard his boots on the barn floor that was different from the sound she made for anyone else. Small things, the kind that accumulate into knowing a place. She was still not entirely well. The ribs had healed to the point where she could breathe without managing it, but there were mornings when the cold made them ache in a way that reminded her, precisely and without sentiment, of what had happened. The wire cuts on her wrists had faded to thin pink lines that would eventually go silver. The gash above her hairline had closed into a scar that her hair covered when she pinned it up, which was most of the time. She had written to Harlan Voss twice since Rawlins. He had written back 3 times, which was his way of ensuring she was informed without burdening her with things that weren't yet resolved. The federal inquiry was proceeding. 2 of the men named in the ledger had retained legal counsel and were maneuvering, as expected, to slow the process. One of them, the county official whose name Elias had recognized from his own land paperwork, had resigned his position in the second week of November, which Voss said was not an admission of guilt in the legal sense, but was in every other sense. Aldous Crane had been suspended from his investigative role, pending a review of his conduct in Wyoming, which answered the question Elias had been holding since the man first appeared at his gate. Crane had not been acting purely on behalf of the state. He had been acting on behalf of the men who needed the evidence to disappear, and the evidence had not disappeared, and now Crane was sitting in the particular uncomfortable position of a man who bet on the wrong outcome. Agnes Croft, the former Hargrove worker who had testified while shaking, had been relocated at Voss's arrangement to a town in Kansas where she had a sister. The 11 children Nora had gotten out of the burning building that October night, the ones who had scattered into the care of a neighboring farm family, and then into the confusion of the aftermath, had been accounted for. 8 of them were placed with proper families through legitimate county arrangements that Voss was monitoring. 2 were with an aunt who had not previously known they existed. 1, the youngest, a 4-year-old girl who had no family record at all and no name anyone could reliably confirm, was in temporary care in Kellerton while Voss worked the legal tangle of her situation. Nora had read that part of Voss's letter twice and then folded it and set it on the windowsill and looked out at the frozen yard for a long time. Elias had come in from the barn and seen her standing there and said nothing, just poured coffee and set a cup near her hand and gone back out. Which was, she had come to understand, how he handled the things he noticed, but understood weren't his to speak to unless asked. She had not yet decided what to ask. The subject of what came next had not been directly addressed between them. This was not avoidance exactly. More the way 2 people who are thinking about the same thing sometimes wait to see which of them will name it first, and in the waiting find out something about each other. The marriage contract still existed. Technically. It had never been voided, never been formally withdrawn by either party, which meant it sat in a legal middle ground that was ambiguous enough to ignore or specific enough to act on, depending on what a person wanted to do with it. Nora had thought about it more than she'd admitted to anyone. She had come to Wyoming under that contract as a practical arrangement. A woman with no particular future and a man with a daughter who needed a household. And everything that had happened since had so thoroughly complicated and altered the terms of that original understanding that the document itself seemed like something from a different story. A story about two strangers who had written practical letters to each other about cooking and hard winters and not having illusions. She still didn't have many illusions. That part hadn't changed, but she had cracked ribs that ached in the cold, and a small scar above her hairline, and a calf named after her that was growing at an unreasonable pace. And she had spent 3 weeks in a house where an 8-year-old brought her broth every 2 hours without being asked. And a man sat in the back row of a courtroom for 2 full days because he wanted to hear the whole story. And she had pressed her hands into cold ground under the roots of a sycamore tree and pulled out a packet of paper that had cost her more than she had expected to pay. And that cost had been worth something. And the worth of it was connected to this place and these people in a way she could not cleanly separate. She was thinking about all of this on a morning in late November when Lucy came into the kitchen with her coat half buttoned and her braid coming undone, and a look on her face that meant she had decided to say something she had been working up to for some time. She sat down at the table across from Nora. Nora waited. "Are you going to stay?" Lucy asked. No preamble. No approach from the side. Just the question, direct. Because Lucy had determined that indirect approaches wasted time, and she had gotten that from somewhere. "I'm thinking about it," Nora said. "What is there to think about?" "Quite a bit, actually." Lucy considered this with the expression she used for things she found insufficiently reasoned. "You like it here," she said. It was not a question. "Yes." "And we like you being here." "I know. And the calf is named after you, which means you're basically already part of the ranch." She said this as if it were a legally binding point. Nora looked at her. "Does your father know you're having this conversation?" "No," Lucy said immediately. "He would tell me it's not my business." "He'd be right." "He'd also be wrong," Lucy said, which was such a perfectly reasonable and unreasonable thing that Nora had to look out the window for a moment to get her expression under control. "Lucy," she said. "I'm just saying what's true," Lucy said. "You don't have to go anywhere. You could just not go. And then everything would be the way it should be." Nora looked at her for a moment. At this girl who had tied a blue ribbon in her hair to meet a stranger and left it tied through everything that followed. Who had named a calf and brought broth and sat in the courtroom doorway when Elias had finally sent her to wait outside. Who had said, "If she gets hurt, my papa will know it was you," to a man twice her size with the full weight of her conviction behind every word. "Go finish your braid," Nora said. Lucy pushed back her chair and stood. At the kitchen doorway she stopped. "Nora." "Yes." "My mother used to say that the people worth keeping are the ones who stay, even when it's easier to leave." She paused. "She also said sometimes you have to tell people that, because they talk themselves out of it." Then she went down the hall, leaving the observation where it was, like a stone set deliberately in someone's path. Nora sat at the kitchen table for a while after that. The coffee in her cup went cold, and she didn't notice. She found Elias in the barn that afternoon, working on a section of fence rail that had rotted through and needed replacing before the hard cold set in. He was doing it the way he did most things, with the particular focus of a man who finds it easier to think clearly when his hands are occupied. And he heard her come in, but didn't stop what he was doing. She sat on a hay bale and watched him work for a while. "Lucy talked to me this morning," she said. He continued working. "I'm not responsible for what she says." "She said you'd say it wasn't her business." "It isn't." "She also said you'd be wrong." He set down the rail and looked at her. Nora looked back at him. She had been constructing this conversation in her head since the kitchen, arranging and rearranging it, and now that she was in it, she found that all the arrangements fell away, and what was left was simply the truth, which was both easier and harder than anything she'd rehearsed. "The contract is still valid," she said. "Technically," he said. "I'm aware of what technically means." She folded her hands in her lap. "I'm also aware that what the contract was for, what both of us thought we were doing when we wrote those letters, is not the same as what's actually happened here, and I don't want to act on a document just because it exists." "All right," he said. "But I also don't want to leave," she said. "And I want you to know that's not because I don't have anywhere else to go, because I probably do. Voss would help me settle somewhere if I asked, and it's not because of the inquiry. I can participate in that from anywhere with a telegraph line. Well, yes, Boxy. She paused. I want to stay because I've been here and I know what it is, and most of my life I didn't know what the place I was in actually was. I always knew it was temporary. I always kept myself ready to move. She looked at him directly. I don't want to keep myself ready to move anymore. Elias looked at her for a moment. He had a plank of wood in his hands and he set it down against the barn wall with the care of someone making sure he had his hands free. The contract was a starting point, he said. That's all it ever was. A starting point for people who didn't know each other yet. We know each other now, she said. Some, he said honestly. Enough to know there's more to know. That's true of everyone. It is, he agreed. He came and sat on the hay bale across from her, which brought them close enough that the conversation became something different, less formal, more like two people working something out in real time without a net. I'm not easy to live with, he said. I'm in my own head too much. I forget to say things I assume are obvious. I put up too much and I hold things too long before I say them. I know, she said. I've been here 3 weeks. And you've had a fair amount of your own situation to manage, which means this has not been an accurate picture of ordinary life here. Ordinary life includes crises, she said. That's fairly ordinary. He almost smiled. My daughter has appointed herself your advocate. I noticed. She's 8. She's extremely effective for 8. He looked at his hands for a moment, then back at her. I'd like you to stay, he said, not because of the contract, because of who you are and because this place has been better since you've been in it, and not just in the ways I expected when I wrote those letters. He paused. I don't know how to make that sound less plain than it is. It doesn't need to sound like anything other than what it is, she said. They sat with that for a moment in the way of two people who have said the necessary things and are waiting for the weight of them to settle. The wedding was supposed to be October 15th, Nora said. It was. We missed it by a considerable margin. We had a complicated October. She looked at him. Something moved in her face, not quite the laugh she hadn't been able to afford since she arrived, but the edge of one, the shape of it. We did, she said. Spring is a better time anyway, he said. Ground's not frozen. Easier to have people over. She looked at him. If that's what you wanted, he added, to make it formal, eventually. When things are less, yes, she said. He stopped. Yes, she said again, in case it had been unclear. That's what I want. Outside the barn, the wind moved across the yard and rattled the door on its stuck hinge, and then passed on. Fuss shifted in her stall and made the sound she made, and one of the other horses answered it from across the barn, and all of it was exactly as ordinary as it was supposed to be. The full federal inquiry concluded the following April, 8 months after the events in Kellerton. It was not fast, and it was not clean, and it was not, in the way of these things, entirely satisfying. The law's version of resolution tends to be incomplete in ways that the human need for justice finds frustrating. 2 of the men named in the ledger negotiated arrangements that reduced their exposure in exchange for testimony against the others, which meant they paid fines that were significant to ordinary people and inconvenient to men of their resources, and served time that was measured in months rather than years. One of the investors fled the territory before arrest and was apprehended eventually in Missouri and extradited and tried, and his trial went on long enough that the newspapers lost interest before the verdict came in. The director of the Hargrove home, a man named Creel, who had run the institution for 11 years and whose name had appeared on the letter in Nora's oilskin packet, was convicted on 4 counts and sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. It was not, in Voss's measured opinion, commensurate with what he had done, but it was what the evidence supported under the specific legal framework available. And Voss said, in the letter where he laid this out to Nora, that imperfect justice was still justice, and that the alternative to imperfect justice was no justice at all, and he had learned over 30 years of legal practice to take what he could hold. Aldous Crane was formally investigated and found to have accepted payment from one of the named investors in exchange for information about the inquiry's progress and for his efforts to suppress Nora's testimony. He lost his investigative license. He was not imprisoned, which was the part that left a specific taste in the mouth when you thought about it too long. Agnes Croft sent Nora a letter from Kansas in February. It was short, she was not a woman who wrote at length, and it said only that she was well, that she had found work at a dry goods store, and that she thought about the children often and hoped they were all right. She asked if Nora had any news of the 4-year-old girl with no records. Nora wrote back. She had news. Quote, the girl's name, assembled through Voss's considerable effort and the records of 2 counties, was Clara. No last name that could be verified. 4 years old when Nora had lifted her through a window above a burning building in October, which made her nearly 5 by spring. She had been in temporary care in Kellerton for 5 months, while the legal questions around her status were sorted, which was 5 months too long for a child that age in a temporary situation. And Voss knew it and had said so in writing to the court, and the court had proceeded at its own pace regardless. Nora had written to Voss in December. She had written carefully, and she had thought about the letter for a week before she sent it, and she had told Elias what she was thinking before she wrote it, because it was not a decision she was willing to make without him knowing she was making it. He had listened to the whole of it, sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee, and when she finished he said, "You'd want to bring her here, if it were possible. If you agreed." She had looked at him steadily. "I know this is not what any letter or contract discussed. I know it changes things." "What does it change?" he asked. She stopped. "Tell me specifically what it changes," he said, not challenging, genuinely asking, in the way he asked things when he wanted to be sure he understood exactly. She thought about it. "The size of what we're taking on. We have a ranch," he said. "We have a room. We have—" He paused, and his mouth did the thing it did when something was slightly amusing to him, in a way he wasn't going to make a production of. A considerable amount of apple preserve put up for winter. She looked at him. "Write the letter," he said. She had written it. The legal process took until March. Voss handled most of it with the efficiency of a man who had navigated similar situations before and knew where the paper jams were likely to occur. There were 2 hearings, both in Rawlings, both before Judge Carey, who by this point knew Nora's name and her face, and had the manner of a man who had decided she was more likely to appear as a petitioner than a defendant going forward, and had adjusted his orientation toward her accordingly. Clara arrived on the 14th of April on the afternoon stage. She was small for her age, with light brown hair cut short because someone at the care home had apparently decided short was easier, and she had the particular wariness of a child who has learned that new places sometimes lead to worse places, and is maintaining her assessment of the situation until further evidence presents itself. She was clutching a cloth rabbit that had seen considerable use, and she stood on the platform of the Larimer Crossing Depot and looked at Nora and did not move toward her or away from her. Nora crouched down to her level. Her ribs were healed by April, fully, properly healed, but she still moved with a careful deliberateness that had become habit. "I'm Nora," she said. Clara looked at her with the rabbit pressed against her chest. "Do you remember me?" Nora asked. A long pause. Then Clara said, "You carried me." "Yes," Nora said. "I did." Another pause. Then Clara looked past Nora to where Elias stood a few yards back, and to Lucy beside him, who was exercising the same heroic self-restraint she had exercised on the porch the day Nora returned from Rawlings, staying where she was when everything about her posture said she would rather close the distance immediately. "That's Elias," Nora said, "and that's Lucy. They're—" She stopped. She had been about to say, "They're the people I live with," or "They're the family I'm part of," and both of those were true, and neither of them was the right shape for what she wanted to say. "They're home," she said finally. "That's what they are." Clara looked at her. "You could come see," Nora said, "if you wanted." Clara looked at the rabbit in her hands. Then she looked back at Nora. Then she reached out with her free hand and took Nora's, which was either because she had decided to trust her or because she was cold, and it was April in Wyoming and someone's hand was available, and maybe those 2 things were not as different as they sounded. Lucy, from 6 feet away, made a sound of suppressed feeling that she immediately converted into a cough. Elias put his hand on top of Lucy's head. They went home. The wedding happened in May, which Elias had been right about. Spring was better, the ground unfrozen. the light lasting longer in the evening so that things finished before dark without anyone having to rush. It was not a large ceremony. Voss came from Cheyenne because he had said he would like to, and Nora had been glad to hear it. Deke and his wife came. Dr. Prentice came and brought his wife and looked satisfied in the manner of a man who had treated injuries that could have gone the other way and is glad they didn't. Cal Whitmore came, which Elias noted and said nothing about, because Cal had also been one of the 3 men who had stood on his porch and suggested he should give Nora up. And the fact that he came anyway was its own kind of accounting. The ceremony was at the courthouse in Larimer Crossing, in front of a justice of the peace who had married enough frontier couples to have developed a version of the words that was honest without being ornate. He said what needed to be said. Elias and Nora said what needed to be said back. Lucy stood beside Nora as a witness, which had been her own idea, and which Nora had agreed to without hesitation, and she held Clara's hand through the whole of it, because Clara was still, in April and May, in the process of deciding how much she trusted new situations. And Lucy had appointed herself the person who held Clara's hand during that process, the same way she had appointed herself Nora's caretaker the night Elias brought a stranger home from a field. It was, like all real things, imperfect. The justice of the peace stumbled on a word and corrected himself. Nora's voice caught once and she cleared it and continued. Elias said his part in the plain, direct way he said most things, without dressing it up, which was how she knew he meant it. Clara, midway through, asked Lucy in a whisper what was happening, and Lucy, without looking away from the front of the room, whispered back, "Our family is getting official." And that was the most accurate description of the event that anyone produced. Afterward, on the steps of the courthouse, Voss shook Elias's hand and then turned to Nora with the expression of a man who has run a long errand and is finally, properly finished with it. "You should know," he said, "that the children are all accounted for. The last placement was confirmed last week. Agnes wrote to me." Nora looked at him. "All 11, he said. She nodded once. Her jaw was working slightly. She put her hand briefly over his and then took it back because she was not, as a general rule, a person who demonstrated things in public that she felt most strongly, and Voss knew that and didn't require it. "Thank you," she said. "You did most of it," he said. "I did the part in the burning building," she said. "You did the rest." He shook his head slightly, the way he always did when she distributed credit. He felt he deserved more than he was getting, and then he went to find his coat, because the May evening had a chill in it that reminded you it was still Wyoming. There is a particular question that stories like this one make people want to ask, which is, did it last? Did it hold? Did the people who chose each other in the middle of a hard season stay chosen when the hard season ended and ordinary life came back, with all its smaller and more grinding difficulties? The honest answer is that ordinary life is not easier than crisis. It is differently hard. It requires a different kind of staying, not the dramatic kind, not the kind that asks you to ride through dark fields or sit in a courtroom for 2 days or hold a line against a man with a warrant at your door, but the sustained, unspectacular kind that asks you to be present and accountable on the days when nothing is at stake except the basic maintenance of being who you said you were. Elias was still too much in his own head. He still forgot to say things he assumed were obvious and held things too long before he said them. And there were mornings when the house felt pressured by his silence in a way that required Nora to decide whether to press or wait, and she did not always decide correctly. Nora was not easy either. She had opinions and she was accustomed to managing things alone. And the adjustment to managing things with someone who also had opinions was not seamless. She was quick to assume that offers of help were judgments of her capability, which was a habit from years of being on her own that did not dissolve simply because the circumstances had changed. Elias learned gradually to hand her things instead of asking if she needed help with them. She learned, more slowly, that being helped was not the same as being found insufficient. Clara, at 5, and then 6, and then 7, was a child who took time. She woke up frightened sometimes and had to be sat with. And there were weeks when she was closed and unreachable in the way of a child recalibrating her relationship with safety. And the closed weeks were harder than anyone said out loud because everyone in the house knew what was behind them and felt the weight of it. But she also learned, over time, the names of all the horses and where the kitchen matches were kept and how to make biscuits that were not flat, and she called Elias Papa first when she was 6. quietly, in passing, as if testing whether the word would hold, and it held, and after that she used it without testing. Lucy grew up in the way of determined children, all at once, it seemed, and then more thoroughly than you expected. She was 12 when Clara came to them, and by 14 she was the person Clara went to first with problems she didn't want to bring to adults. And by 16 she was running a portion of the ranch's accounting because she had discovered she was good with numbers, and Elias had discovered there was no point arguing with Lucy about things she was good at. The ranch changed. Not immediately, and not by anyone's deliberate plan exactly, more the way land changes when it is consistently cared for and consistently used, accumulating improvements that each feel small at the time and together become something distinct. The extra room was built in the second year, and then the addition to the barn, and then the second garden bed that Nora put in because she had decided that the ranch's approach to vegetables was unnecessarily conservative. In the third year, a boy of 9 arrived, not by legal placement, but because a neighboring family had taken in a child they couldn't keep, and Elias and Nora had room and had done it before and said yes. In the fourth year, 2 sisters who were placed by the county arrangement that Voss had set up specifically to route children to verified households with space and stability. They were 8 and 6. They arrived in October. Nobody planned for the ranch to become what it became. These things rarely plan themselves. They accumulate from a series of individual decisions that each seem manageable and together become a direction. And at some point you look up from the daily work of it and realize you are further from where you started than you thought and exactly where you were going. The town had a specific relationship to the Boone Ranch that shifted over those years. The way public opinion shifts when it has been demonstrably wrong and has to quietly reassemble itself into a different position. Owen Ferris from the bank, who had stood on the porch and suggested Nora should be surrendered to Crane, made a point of greeting her by name when she came into town, and there was an acknowledgement in it that was never spoken directly. Theodore Holt donated lumber for the barn addition. Carl Deming's wife brought a pie when Clara arrived, which was a form of apology that everyone pretended was just a pie. Larimer Crossing was not transformed. It remained a frontier town with all the limitations and occasional meannesses of frontier towns. But the Boone Ranch had a reputation there, and the reputation was specific. It was the place where people who needed to be somewhere were. That was how people described it. Not a home exactly, though it was that, and not an institution, which it never became despite the number of children who passed through it or stayed. Just a place where people who needed to be somewhere were, which is perhaps the most fundamental thing any place can be for any person, and the thing hardest to find and easiest to take for granted once you have it. In the fall of the year that Clara turned 9, she came home from school and found Nora in the kitchen doing accounts, and sat at the table and put her schoolbook down and said, without preface, "Emma Whitmore says you used to be in trouble." Nora looked up from the accounts. "She says her father said you were wanted by an investigator," Clara said, "and that Mr. Boone kept you here when everyone said he shouldn't." "That's mostly accurate," Nora said. "She says it like it's bad," Clara said. Some people thought so at the time. Clara considered this. She was 9 and thin and still had the short hair that had grown out over 4 years into something that Lucy had learned to braid. And she had Nora's directness in her, which was either something she'd had always or something she'd acquired from proximity, and probably some of both. "Were you scared?" Clara asked. "Yes," Nora said honestly. "But you didn't leave." "I couldn't leave. I didn't have anywhere to go." "But after," Clara said. "When you could have, you didn't." Nora set down her pen. "No," she said. "I didn't." "Why?" Nora looked at her for a moment. At this child who had been carried through a window above a fire when she was 4 years old and who did not remember it, or said she didn't, though sometimes Nora thought she did, that there were things in her that knew something had happened and had oriented themselves accordingly. This child who had taken her hand on a depot platform in April and asked what was happening when 2 people made themselves official and received our family as getting official as a sufficient answer. This was the place where I needed to be, Nora said, and it turned out it also needed me. And those 2 things don't happen at the same time very often. When they do, you stay. Clara looked at the schoolbook on the table. Then she looked back at Nora. "I'm going to tell Emma Whitmore her father was wrong," she said. "You can tell her," Nora said, "but you don't have to. What Emma Whitmore's father thinks about how things were 4 years ago doesn't change how things are. Clara thought about this with the expression she used for things she found partially but not entirely convincing. I'm going to tell her anyway, she said. I know, Nora said. She picked up her pen and went back to the accounts, and Clara opened her school book, and the kitchen was quiet in the way it was quiet on fall afternoons when the light came in at the specific angle that made the table warm. And outside the window, the sycamore at the south edge of the property sets. The one on the ranch land, not the one by the road, though they shared a resemblance, had gone yellow and was losing its leaves in the way things let go of what they've been carrying when the season finally makes it reasonable to do so. There is no clean way to say what this story means because stories that are honestly told don't usually mean one thing. They hold several things at once, some of which contradict each other. What is true is this. Nora Ash came to Wyoming in a grain sack, which is not how anyone intends to arrive anywhere. And what she found when she got here was not what she had written letters about. Not the practical arrangement, not the solution to the problem of being a woman alone in a world that was not organized for her convenience. What she found was harder and less certain and more real than anything she could have anticipated when she put her name on a contract in Ohio and got on a stage and headed west. She found a man who read every word before he signed anything and held the line when holding it cost him. Not because he was heroic, but because he had decided early what kind of person he was going to be and had kept that decision consistently, even when it was inconvenient, which is the unglamorous version of integrity that actually sustains people over time. She found a child who tied a ribbon in her hair and named a calf after a stranger because she had decided the stranger was going to matter, and who was right, and who had never once needed anyone to confirm she was right before she acted on it. She found a place that the cold moved through in a particular way, and where the light hit the kitchen table in the mornings at an angle that made everything look warmer than it was, and she found that this was not nothing. Belonging is not a thing granted. It is not assigned by birth, or by contract, or by the agreement of the community around you, though all of those things have their weight. Belonging is built, incrementally, out of the daily choice to stay and be present and accountable, to carry your share of what needs carrying without making a performance of it, to know a place well enough that you notice when the barn door sticks and you lift the handle when you push it. It is built out of bringing broth every 2 hours when someone needs it, and sitting in the back row of a courtroom when someone needs that, and holding a child's hand on a depot platform when she doesn't yet know if the new place is safe. Nora Ash had spent most of her life not knowing where she belonged. She had been practical about that for so long that she had almost convinced herself the question didn't matter, that belonging was a luxury for people whose circumstances were more stable than hers, that what she needed was not a home, but a plan. She had been wrong about that, which was uncomfortable to admit and worth admitting. On a morning in November, 5 years after Elias Boone had found her under a sycamore tree in a field 2 miles south of a town she had never reached, Nora stood at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee going warm in her hands and watched her husband crossing the yard toward the barn in the particular way he crossed it every morning, with the collar of his coat turned up and his hat low and his attention already on whatever needed doing. And she thought, there it is. That is what it looks like. Not perfect, not resolved into something clean, just present and chosen and continuing. The frost was on the ground again. The horses stood close together in the corral. From the back of the house she could hear Lucy's voice and Clara's, some ongoing negotiation about something that was probably not important and completely necessary, the way most negotiations between children are. The kitchen was warm. She turned from the window and went to start breakfast, which needed doing, and which she did.
So rad, you got to do that. Hell yes. Right now, the cost of medical bills and the salary is at 30K. So it's only going to be more adding in pain and suffering aspect as well. Oh, I see, Gio. Yeah. Especially if they rehash it too. That fucking sucks, man. But I really hope the best that you get the settlement. Exactly what Vader said. I really hope that they get you what you need. Yeah, I was literally attacked by an employee of the business because I told him to do. Oh shit, dude, that's fucking ridiculous. But yeah, look